So as archaeology begins to continue to grow outside of the university classroom, one of the things that we all have to remember is there is no educational requirement for criticizing archaeology. And that's fine. Anybody can publicly criticize anything, but we should all be slow to our own conclusions. Gobekli Tepe is a site that rewrote history, and it pushed back the time with which we thought sedentary cultures existed by many thousands of years. For centuries, the oldest known civilizations were Egypt and Mesopotamia, both beginning sometime around 4000 BC. But just 30 some odd years ago, Gobekli Tepe was discovered, and it pushed back the beginning of civilization by another 6,000 years to sometime around 10,000 BC. Now, people will argue that Gobekli Tepe doesn't technically meet the qualifications of a civilization, but I would imagine that you need a large number of people with a steady amount of food, whether that is hunting and killing animals mixed with foraging, or whether or not that is the beginning of agriculture. You probably need a huge, at least semi-sedentary population to gather together and erect these megalithic monuments. There's some academic debate over whether or not agriculture made people settle down in that area, or people settled down in that area and then invented agriculture. Either way, what we call a civilization is a bit arbitrary, and it's based on a multitude of factors, but for simplicity's sake, I'm going to call it a civilization. And it's totally fine if you disagree. Now, recently there's been a lot of debate over the archaeological practices that are taking place at Gobekli Tepe. Archaeologists aren't working fast enough. Archaeologists don't care enough about making new, huge discoveries at the site. The poor state of the enclosure built to protect the site. The various trees growing around the site, and the olive tree orchards planted on top of the archaeological ruins. And then there's the potential connection to the World Economic Forum. There's a lot to digest here, and this video isn't necessarily to prove or disprove each and every one of those topics, but rather to give you a level-headed and realistic approach as things like this happen in the future, so that none of us are so easily swayed to one side or the other. And it's easy for everybody, myself included, to be swayed to the side of the information that you were initially exposed to. So the very first thing that we should all realize is that your average typical archaeologist who is doing backbreaking work in the dirt and grime and mud on the opposite side of the planet from where they live, separated from their families and making absolutely no money, has no incentive and is not being paid enough to contribute to a worldwide conspiracy to hide an ancient truth from all of us. And if you want proof, just last week, I spent an entire day with the head archaeologist at Sacsayhuaman, which is sitting just above Cusco, Peru, which is an ancient megalithic site, one of the great mysteries of the ancient world. And that guy probably doesn't even get paid 1/100th of what his work is worth to the world. I had breakfast in his very humble home, and the work that he has done at that site is so monumental, and a YouTuber could visit that site for one afternoon and broadcast to the entire planet about how that archaeologist specifically is hiding the true history of Sacsayhuaman from the rest of the world, and he would generate more revenue from that one video than that guy might make in an entire year, or maybe even his entire career. And that archaeologist has been working there for a decade, living right across the street from Sacsayhuaman. Now, is there corruption in archaeology? Of course there is. It's a field run by human beings, and corruption is going to be an inherent factor. But the vast majority of archaeologists are not in on it. What really happens is, sometimes in some places, there are people, specific people that are put in charge of major archaeological regions or major archaeological areas or digs, and they carry out unauthorized and unsupervised digs where they're able to somehow isolate an artifact and sell it on a black market. And they sell those artifacts on the black market to countries like Russia, China, and so on. I mean, hell, even I was reached out to by foreign agents to sell any artifacts that I may have found. So if even I am being reached out to by these people, it must be a booming market. that I obviously don't participate in. In my opinion, if a conspiracy theory doesn't somehow convey that somebody is directly enriching themselves from participating in it, then I don't think it's a very logical conspiracy. And trust me, I'm the type of person that I believe if you don't believe in conspiracy theories at all, then you're not a very wise person. But getting rich is the only incentive for someone to take such big risks. And this money comes from unnamed billionaires or trillionaire families who have contacts with antiquity sellers, illegal antiquity sellers, I should say, who these antiquity sellers also have contacts with people who are the heads of certain archaeological digs. And all of this remains under the table, and the poor archaeologist who actually broke his back just to exhume the artifact is probably never given any credit for the discovery at all, and probably never actually is told what happened to that artifact. It just disappears. Now, the olive trees that are planted at Gobekli Tepe are supposedly planted by the previous owners to increase the value of the land before they sold it to the Turkish state. One thing we all have to know is that these olive trees are flat-rooted, meaning they're minimally invasive as compared to other trees. And this is a pretty damn common thing throughout the Mediterranean world. There are lots of archaeological sites that have had olive trees growing on them for thousands of years, and archaeologists still today have to dig around them. So this isn't an isolated issue to Gobekli Tepe. However, the Turkish state did acquire Gobekli Tepe, I believe, back in 2005, and they still have not removed the trees. Why is that? Well, it's possible that these trees are actually for what we call erosion control, where the roots essentially act as a net over the archaeological site. And to my understanding, in some ways actually protect the site, and they stop running water from carrying away the soil that encases the site. Another, perhaps more realistic possibility is that expanding excavations at Gobekli Tepe would be such a drastic expense that they're just not willing to take. And they are content with moving forward at the pace that they're at and leaving the trees where they have been for the last 20 years or longer. If they were to drastically expand the excavations at Gobekli Tepe, the maintenance and security upkeep alone would run into the millions per year. Now, I just don't know if their archaeological department is going to allot the money for that, because if you look at the city of Ephesus in Turkey, which is the most visited archaeological site in the entire country, it generates about 20 million USD per year. And that's at about 2 million annual visitors. Gobekli Tepe, on the other hand, sees about 500,000 annual visitors. And I see estimates from anywhere to about 1 million to 5 million in revenue from tourists visiting the site per year. And with those margins, the Turkish government probably just doesn't at all feel the incentive to carry out further excavations because the margins just aren't there. And sure, I think all of us wish that the excavations would move faster. I want to see this place be majority excavated in my own lifetime. But where's the money to do it? You know, it has to economically make sense for the government too. You know, that $1 to $5 million in revenue per year probably gets eaten up pretty fast when you consider maintenance and security costs, as well as paying the approximately 100 staff members that work at Gobekli Tepe. And then I'm sure some of that money does end up in government officials' pockets. And then on top of that, I'm sure that some of the revenue from Gobekli Tepe is used to excavate other sites that are nearby, like the other Tepe sites. If all the resources that are gained from tourism at Gobekli Tepe were then taken and put towards further excavation, I can almost guarantee you that places like Karahan Tepe would never be excavated. And this brings me to my next point. What do we think would actually be found if Gobekli Tepe could be 95% excavated? Well, let's say that hypothetically you only had the resources to excavate 5% of the site. That's what they say has been excavated so far, and in the last 20 years it really hasn't moved much from 5% at all. But hypothetically, let's just say that you and I only have the resources to excavate 5% of the site. Well, where would we start? You would scan what we can see from the top of the site, and we would probably pick the most monumental central portion of Gobekli Tepe to excavate. And that's exactly what they did. You know, there are these big YouTube channels that are pushing this idea that if Gobekli Tepe could just be further excavated, that it would reveal the true history of our ancient past, and that they're trying to cover up something that's buried within the ruins around Gobekli Tepe. I don't think they're explicitly saying that, but that's sort of what they're alluding to and wanting people to believe. And having seen maybe over 100 archaeological sites in person, I can almost certainly tell you, if I could snap my finger and make Gobekli Tepe become, if I could excavate the remaining 95% of the site, this is what we'd find. We'd find more T-pillars, more strange depictions of animals, more strange depictions of people. We'd find more strange T-pillars depicting humans with their hands down by their crotch, very similar to the way we see some statues all around the world. The serious likelihood is that if we could instantly excavate the remaining 95% of Gobekli Tepe, we would find ourselves in even more abundance of the same mystery. Now, if I could snap my fingers and have Gobekli Tepe perfectly excavated and maintained, of course I would do that. My own curiosity wishes that this was a site that the Turkish government wanted to allocate all of their extra resources towards giving it a majority excavation that I feel like, and millions of other people feel like, the site deserves. But the unfortunate reality is the vast majority of archaeological sites all around the world will never reach 10% excavation. You can look at Teotihuacan, which they say is only 4 to 6% excavated. You can look at, I mean, even think about a site, Machu Picchu, which is one of the most monumental archaeological sites and most famous places in the entire planet. It's only 30% excavated. The vast majority of the archaeological sites in the Maya world will never even reach 1% completion. Hell, the entire Maya world will probably never reach 1% completion. Now, one of the pushbacks that I've seen from archaeologists is that just tearing apart the sites and selfishly excavating it to appease our own curiosities would be wrong. When in 150 years, future archaeologists will have better and less invasive techniques to study the site while also perfectly preserving it. And I think if you're being honest with yourself and you're being rational, you can't help but understand that sentiment. But again, as the saying goes, the earth belongs to the living. And I certainly understand the desire, curiosity, and the urge to have the majority of this site excavated for the generation that discovered it. Because there is really no promise that the world in the way that it exists today is actually going to be around in 150 years. This feels like one of those places, like the pyramids of Giza, that our generation would want to dive into and fully excavate for ourselves. I perfectly understand both sides of the coin, and honestly, I'm going to have to lean on what Marcus Aurelius says, and that nobody is asking for my opinion here. The world is not asking for my opinion, so I shouldn't worry about it. We kind of just have to accept some of these things the way that they are, especially, you know, I am talking to Americans and Britons here. That's mostly who watches my channel, and it's a foreign government. They don't care what we think. And that's where I get to the reality of this, is that the Turkish state doesn't care what Americans and Britons and Mexicans think, people in the Western world think. They will determine what happens to this site. They will determine the pace at which the archaeological digs are carried out, and they are going forward. And it's completely false that they have stopped excavations. The excavations are continuing. I believe that a new season is coming up here soon at Gobekli Tepe, and they're not completely reburying the site and cementing it forever. That is a normal practice in archaeology, that one of the best things you can do to preserve a site after you have completed your dig in the certain portion is you backfill it so that it stays preserved. You can look at some of the Moai statues on Easter Island or Rapa Nui that have been unearthed 150 years later or a century later. Some of the glyphs and markings on them and the depictions on the Moai are gone. And it's the same thing in the Olmec world. When some of these monuments are excavated and they're not reburied, you can look at an illustration of what the artifact used to look like 100 years ago and then go see it in person, and it's unrecognizable. Backfilling it is a simple way of preserving an archaeological site. So all we as Westerners can do is just analyze the data that we already have. The purpose of this video is not to justify or denounce decisions made by people that I think are incompetent or are competent. But just to give myself and everyone watching a level-headed approach to things like this in the future, because this is just going to be the first of probably hundreds of situations and topics like this that will arise throughout our lifetime. And I think it's important that none of us are swayed to one side or the other based on the information that we're initially exposed to, because things are never as simple as they seem, and they're never completely one way or the other. It's usually there's something happening in the middle, and we need to take a logical approach to everything. And we need to know that, these accusations of corruption, sometimes when you're being presented or someone is trying to convince you of a conspiracy, I would really urge you guys and myself to just take it slowly. If there's no way that somebody is immediately enriching themselves from participating in this conspiracy, do they really have enough incentive to take that big of a risk? Concealing ancient knowledge just isn't good enough. People need to be getting rich and having an abundance in life to feel the incentive to participate in a conspiracy like this. And the vast majority of your standard archaeologists are broke. And the very few that are corrupt and are selling artifacts on the black market, well, the incentive there is very clear. They're making money hand over fist. And they do have all the incentive in the world to hide and conceal and thicken the veil around certain archaeological sites so that people don't go poking around too much, to potentially expose this area of the black market that they participate in. And while I said earlier that black antiquities market must be booming, it certainly is not even close to the majority of archaeologists. But the real question is, why are archaeologists hiding the Roman coins that were found on the moon? I'm Luke Caverns. If you'd like to learn more about ancient civilizations and lost history, well, please like and subscribe for more.